Hey guys, welcome to SoftTube. My name is Hemant. Today we're going to look at how GraphQL is used along with the Blazor WebAssembly. Before jumping into the code, let me do a quick intro on Blazor and GraphQL. Yeah, Blazor is a free and open source web framework developed by Microsoft, which uses C# and HTML as a client-side programming language. Blazor apps can be developed in two ways. One is using Blazor server and another one by using Blazor WebAssemblies. Under Blazor WebAssemblies, the components which is written on C# get converted to .NET assemblies, and these assemblies is get downloaded to the client browser, along with the WebAssembly based .NET runtime, which is a tiny .NET runtime called Mono runtime is downloaded to the client browser to execute .NET components. This is Blazor WebAssembly project. Under developer window, you can see WebAssembly based .NET runtime is downloaded at the browser. So coming to GraphQL, GraphQL is a query language for APIs. And GraphQL is open source server-side technology which was developed by Facebook to optimize the RESTful APIs. GraphQL are widely used in many large size and mid-size web applications like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and New York Times. Guys, let me show you the biggest advantage of using GraphQL over the normal APIs. In the normal API, whenever a user requests for a resource from an endpoint, entire object is returned. All the item from the object is returned. Here, user might not need all the information which is downloaded in the client. He might need only the status or image or the description, but all the object is downloaded at the client side in the normal API. But let's look at how GraphQL is used to optimize this API. Here in this GraphQL example, I'm requesting for a student. When I request, all the items under the student entities are returned. The beauty of GraphQL is if the user needs only the first name, we only get the first name. If the user needs the first name and the last name, only the first name and the last name is returned. So this way the APIs are optimized. And another thing is GraphQL uses single endpoint for all the requests. For all the CRUD operation, it will be a single endpoint. Whereas the normal API uses different endpoints for different resources. Like if you request for users, it's a different endpoint. So this is a different endpoint. So GraphQL uses single endpoint for all the operations. This is a Blazor WebAssembly app which uses GraphQL APIs for the data. This page is using GraphQL APIs for insert, update, and delete. Let's see how we can implement this using Blazor WebAssembly and GraphQL APIs. First, let's start with GraphQL APIs. For this, we need a database. So add new database, demo. So add new table here. So ID, set as primary key, name, page. So let's set the identity as true. So now the table is ready. Let's name it as student. Okay, our table is ready now. Student. Okay. Let me bring up Visual Studio. Here I'm using Visual Studio 2019. You can also use Visual Studio Code. I'm creating a new project under ASP.NET Core Web Application. I'm giving the name as a GraphQL demo app. Let's select ASP.NET Core empty. So create. Project is ready now. Let me add a model for the entity framework. So model. Let me add a new class. let's add the properties. ID. So, last name, age. Now our model for the student entity is ready. Next step is to add a DB context. For that, add new folder, DB context, add new class, student DB context. To add RDB context, we need a few packages. Let's add it from NuGet package manager. NuGet package manager. Because Entity Framework core. Let's install this. And we need Entity Framework core relations. And we need SQL.NET Core SQL Server, since we are using SQL Server as a database. Now the dependency required for Entity Framework and database is added. Now let's implement DB context. Core. Next, let's add a constructor. In the constructor parameter, let's add DB options. Options. Student options. Base options. Now let's add a DB set for our student entity. DB set student models student. Now the DB sets are ready. Next step is to add configuration for our student entity type. For that, let's add a new folder. Add a class. And to add configuration, we have to implement from identity type configurations. So student. So we required this namespace. Entity type configuration implements configure with the parameter type entity type builder. So let's implement that. To save some time, I have copied all the table configurations to a notepad. Let me copy it from there. This configuration tells about table and its schema and which columns of which are of which type. There is a red squiggly here. This might be a spelling mistake. Age. So here it should be 100 because we have specified it as 100 in the database. So it says is an ID, first name is a string, last name is a string, and age is an integer data type. Next, let's apply this configuration in DB context class under onModelCreate method. Let's open student DB context. For this, we have to implement onModelCreating method under DB context class. Let's see what is the method. So we have to override this method in our class. void, which implements model builder. So model builder, apply configuration, student configuration. Configuration. Add the namespace. Okay. After this, let's call base on model creating a method. This base on model creating. Let's pass model builder object. We are done with model, DB context, and configurations. Next, let's add a GraphQL API. For the GraphQL implementation, I'm going to use HotChocolate ASP.NET Core. HotChocolate is a .NET GraphQL platform which helps us to develop a GraphQL layer on top of existing or new application. HotChocolate is very easy to implement. Let's look at how to implement GraphQL using HotChocolate. Let's open NuGet Package Manager. Search for HotChocolate ASP.NET Core. Install this. And we need a playground to test our GraphQL APIs. So let's install playground. So we have finished installing HotChocolate ASP.NET Core. Let's start using these packages. The first step in GraphQL implementation is we'll add a type for the student entity. So let's add a new folder. GraphQL. Let's add another folder. Type. Let's add a class. Student type. The purpose of this class is this class describes a .NET type to a GraphQL type. For this, we have to implement object type of GraphQL types and override configure method. So object type of student. This is in the namespace HotChocolate types, and this is in the model. So here we have to override configure method. Override. Override. Configure. So it has a parameter iObject type descriptor. So we have to describe the .NET type to a GraphQL type. So let's do it. Let's get rid of this. We don't want base configure to execute. So descriptor field x such that x dot id type. For all the key types, GraphQL uses id type. id type. Because id is our key field in the database, so GraphQL uses this as an id type. So next, let's add a first name, last name, and age. So descriptor field x dot first name type, which is of string GraphQL type. So do it fast. Let me copy this. Last name and age. Age is an int type. So now we have finished describing the fields. Let's add queries and mutations for the GraphQL. In GraphQL terminologies, queries are the term used to get the data from the server, and mutations are the term used in the GraphQL to send the data to the server to update, delete, or to insert. So let's add two folders, one for query, mutations. In the query folder, let's add a new class, query, and to this constructor, let's pass a student DB context. So let's inject student DB context to this constructor. This name space in context. So DB context. Let's inject this. Give us name as student DB context. So DB context equals student DB context. So let's use this for the current invoking object. And next let's add iQueryable object and assign DB context of student, so that GraphQL can able to query the DB context and get the data which is requested from the client. So let's add iQueryable of student. DB context of student. So let's bring the namespace. So query is ready. Next let's add mutations for insert and delete. So let's add an input type for create and delete. So let's add a new folder, input, and add class create student input. And one more class for delete input. Create student input. In create student input, we required first name, last name, and age to create a student. ID is not required. ID is auto generated by the database. So let me copy it to save some time. So we have added first name, last name, and age. Similarly, in the delete, let's add ID, because we only need ID to delete a student record. Next, let's add mutation for the GraphQL. So add new class, mutation. Similarly, like query, we have to inject student DB context into the constructor of this class. So let's inject that. Let me copy this from here. Change the name. Under this mutation, we're going to add two methods. One is to create the student, and another one for delete the student. So let's add that. Student, create student. It has a parameter create student input. Input. So let's, class name is wrong here. Let me correct that. Input. Now it's fine. So var student equals new student. So first name from create, first name, student input, last name, age, age, oh, there's an issue. Oh, we have declared age as a string, so let's make it as int. Let's add this to DB context. Student object is added, and then save changes, and let's return the student again. I'm returning only the student object, so let's have a return type of student. Now our create student mutation is ready, so let's add a delete mutation. Public, let's return a student object even for this mutation. Student student delete student input. Similarly, student student id equals delete student input dot id, db context, db context dot remove student, db context dot save changes, and return student. So we have finished adding delete mutation. Oh, there is an error. Oh, this one needs to be removed. So yeah. Now our create and delete mutations are ready. And the next step is let's add a configuration in the startup class of the project for the GraphQL types, mutation, and query types. So service dot add QL server, and let's add type which we have described in student type class. Student type, this is in this namespace. Next, add query type, QL query, this is in this namespace. Dot add mutation type, GraphQL mutations, and we need to add a scoped object of type GraphQL query and GraphQL mutation. This service add scoped GraphQL query service dot add scoped GraphQL mutation. Next, let's add a DB context for this service. Add pass student DB context, because we are using pass student DB context because by injecting student DB context in all these constructors. So add student context and add options such that options dot we are using SQL Server, use SQL Server. So it's in the namespace core, and let's add a connection string here. Let's bring it from the DB context class. So DB context public static string connection string equals server local database equals, what's our database? GraphQL demo. We are using Windows authentication, so trusted connection equals true. True. So let's use this connection string in our startup class. So this is in student DB context dot DB connection string. So let's add scoped lifetime service lifetime dot scoped. So we have finished configuring the services. Let's add the middleware. Let's add GraphQL middleware as well as playground middleware. So let's add inside in development scope. So app dot use playground. So this is a namespace HotChocolate playground. So new playground options. Let's configure the query path and playground path. So query path will be of this, and for the playground will be playground. So let's add a semicolon here and save it. And after this, let's add a middleware for our GraphQL endpoint such that x dot map GraphQL. So we have finished configuring our middleware. Let's build our application and see if we have any error. So there's no error. So let's run the application. Oh, we have an exception here. We have to add slash. Okay. So let's run the application again. So let's navigate to playground. Yes, So application is running without any problem. So here you can see the docs about all the mutations and queries and schema regarding all the inputs and GraphQL types. So let's start querying the student. So query student, we need ID, first name, last name, and age. Looks like we have a problem with the connection string. Let's fix that. Connection string equals. So let's rerun our application. We fixed that error, and let's see this time. Okay, it's working. Since we don't have any records in the database, we are getting empty items. So let's add a student using mutation. So for this, take a new tab, mutation. Let's give a name, create student. We have to send a parameter create student input. So let's check the docs. Let's create student input. So let's add it, create student input, and let's copy this here, create student input here, create student, create student input, create student input. So let's pass this input in the query variable. First name equals month, last name Kumar, age 32. Let's close this, and we need to change the endpoint. So your endpoint. Let's see the mutation works or not. So we have an error here. There's a mistake. Should be a dollar. Let's check. So I think we need a return type. Okay. So now the object is added. So let's add one more student. Let's request for last name, age, and ID. So I can check here. So once student is added, let's add one more student. So one more student is added. Let's check this. So one more student is added. So our query and mutations are working fine. Let's try deleting the student. So for that, let's take one more tab. Let's copy the endpoint. So again, mutation. Delete student input. delete student, student, delete student, input. Delete student, delete student, input, semicolon, dollar, delete student, input. Let's add the input in the query variable. Delete student input, ID. Let's delete student 2. Let's pass 2. We'll get back ID. So let's try. So I think the student number 2 is deleted. Let's check that. Yes, the student number 2 is deleted. Here we are done with the GraphQL APIs. All our mutations and queries are working as expected. So next we are going to implement Blazor and make Blazor to use these APIs. Yes, to implement Blazor app, let's open Visual Studio 2019. Create new project. Select Blazor app. Next, let's give the name as demo. Create. We're going to use Blazor Webassembly app. Select Blazor Webassembly app. Create. So the Blazor Webassembly app is created. In the project solution window, these are the project files. Let's run this application and see what are the initial pages. Blazor app is running, and these are the default pages you get when you create a Blazor WebAssembly app. And these are the components. We have 3 components: home, counter, and fetch data. Let's add one more component to display student information. Let's close the app now. In the Blazor app, app.razor is the initial component which loads before all other component loads, and all other components load via this component. And import.razor is used to add global references for the Blazor project. Pages folder contains all the components which is used in the Blazor application. Let's add one more component called student data. For that, let's add new item, Blazor component, student data. So the new component student data is added. Let's add a navigation to this component. For that, let's open shade, navigation menu, copy this, and let's say student data here, data, data. Let's add this name to the page statement of student component. At page student data. This statement is added at the beginning of the component so that the anchor tag can navigate to this component. So let's save this and let's run our application and see whether it gets navigated to the student component. So the app is loaded now, and we have got a new navigation link here, and the new component is rendering. So the new component is working fine. Let's add HTML table here in this component and bring in the student information from the GraphQL API. Let's close the application now. Let's go to our component. First step here is to add all the dependency packages. For the GraphQL API request, I'm using dependency called GraphQL Client Abstraction. Let's install that. Client Abstraction. Let's install this. So this is installed. So the next step is to add HTML table. To save some time, I have copied it to a notepad. Let me copy it from there again. Table. Here we have 4 columns: ID, first name, last name, and age. The next step is to add few .NET code at the client side and bring in the student information from the GraphQL API and populate the data to this table. Let's do it. First step is to override components on initialize method. This method is executed when the component is initialized. So on initialize protected. Async. Let's have a private method to get the student information. Private async task student. Next step is to add HTTP client and GraphQL request. For that, we have to add a using statement for GraphQL and inject HTTP client. So let's add using GraphQL and inject HTTP client. So we are done. The next step is to add a query string for the GraphQL get student. So private string students query. So let's return a query string. Let's return a query string. Let's copy it from the request query. So let's get rid of this. So we are done with the query string. Next, let's add this query string to the GraphQL request. So var request equals new GraphQL request query equals, let's pass this query string. So we have finished adding the request. Let's add the HTTP client. Result equals await HTTP client dot post URI and the request. Let's check the success status of the request. Result dot ensure success status code. So the HTTP client is ready. Let's add in the URI. For that, let's copy the URI from the demo app. Go to launch settings. Let's copy the unsecured one. Slash GraphQL QL. Let's save. And the final step is to call this get student from the onInitialize method. So await get student. Let's run this application and see whether we could able to get the data using developer window. So let's run the application. The application is loaded now. Let's navigate to student data. And our GraphQL application is also running in the port number 44383, which is secured one. The unsecured one is running on the port number 54901. Okay, let's open the developer window. Looks like we have an issue with the GraphQL API. We have a CORS issue, so we have to fix this issue from the GraphQL server. Okay, let's close this application now. Let's go to GraphQL app, startup CS. Let's add a CORS policy for this. Service dot add CORS options such that options dot add policy name allow all origin. So builder such that builder dot allow any origin. Instead of allowing all origin, let's add a specific URL, the client. So with origin dot allow any headers and allow any methods. So let's semicolon, say this, let's stop the application. So we have to add the client URL here. So let's get the client URL, that on settings. So this is a port number. So HTTPS localhost. So we are allowing this URL to access the GraphQL API. And next step is to register this middleware. Let's add the CORS middleware. So app dot use CORS. Let's copy the name, add this policy. So we are done. Let's run the GraphQL application again, and let's run the Blazor application. So both the applications are running. Let's navigate to Playground, and let's navigate to student data on the Blazor app and check the developer window now. So there is no more error here. Let's check the network tab, reissue the request, and we are able to get the data from the GraphQL API. So we are able to get the data. So we have to populate this data to the HTML table here. So let's do that. Before that, let's check the response object. There's a data. Inside the data, we have a student's information. Okay, let's close this now. To populate the data to the HTML table, let's first write the properties to hold the JSON data. For that, let's add a model folder. So add new folder, model. Let's add a class student. Let's copy the properties from the GraphQL project. So model student, let's copy this, and let's add one more class to hold the GraphQL data. So public class QL student data, public list of students. Okay, so our objects are ready. Next step is to serialize the JSON response to this object types. So student data. So let's start reading the JSON response. So await result content read from JSON. GraphQL response. To this GraphQL student data type. Let's store this in a variable GQL. There is a red squiggly here. Looks like we have to add a reference to the model. So here, using Blazor app demo dot model. So it's gone now. Next, let's check for the null data. If dot data students not equal to null, then assign to a variable. have a global variable called student. So private list of students list of student. So let's have one more variable for student. Student student student. So the variables are ready. Let's populate to this equals students. So all the information from this get serialized to list of student object. So we have to use the student object to populate this HTML table now. So let's add a razor code. For each student in students, for each student, the first column is ID. So dot ID. Second is first name. Third one is last name. The fourth one is the age. Third one is extra. So now the get request is ready. So the table is ready now. Let's run the application and see how's the behavior. The application has started. Let's navigate to student data. So you can able to see the data is loaded to the table, HTML table. Let me add some style to make this table look good. For this to save some time, I have copied the style to a notepad. Let me copy that and paste this here. So let's give the table ID as student, and let's check the styles now on the table. Okay, the table is now looking good. Now the query is working fine. Let's try the create mutation and delete mutation on this table. Let's go close the application now. Let's add in a new method called create student. So we need a mutation string. Create student query return. Let's copy this again from the playground. Create student. Query equals create student query. And to create, we need to add a variables. So new create student input. Plus new. This will be of type anonymous, and to create a student, we have to pass first name, last name, and age. So first name, last name, and age. So where will we get this first name, last name, and age while creating a student? So we need to add a text boxes below the table so that user can enter the information, and that information is copied to this anonymous types. So let's do that. So let's add one more row after the for loop. we want 4 columns to we want 3 text boxes in a row. So let's add an input text box. Input type equals text, and let's bind the data. Bind value equals student dot dot first name. I'm using this variable here to bind the value to this object. So similarly we'll have for the last name and age. Last name, age. So let's add a button to add a new student. Button. Create student. Let's keep it as create for now. So what we are going to do is, on click of this button, let's call this .NET method. So on click event, let's call create student. It's so simple. Okay, let's make it as an anonymous type because it's an asynchronous method. So close this in a bracket. Okay. Here on click of a button, we are calling this method to create a student. So now we get all the data from the text box. The data we are assigning it to the mutation variables. So student dot first name, student dot last name, student dot age. So the endpoint will be same for all the operations in the GraphQL. So we'll get rid of this, and let's, after insert, just we have to call get student again. Await get student. So it's ready now. Let's add a header here called action. Action. Let's run this and see the behavior. So let's navigate to student data. So there is a problem. We have to slightly move this text box. The text box has to start from this column. Let's do that. Let's add a dummy td. Let's navigate to student data. Now it looks good. So let's try adding a new student here. Bakshi Gupta, age 30. Let's see. Oh, we're able to add the new student here now. So let's add one more student. Gopal Ravi, age 40. Let's be able to add the data. So let's check in the playground. Let's request for student info. So all the students have been added. So we have to get rid of this once the create button is clicked. So let's reinitialize the student object. Let's run again. Let's add to student. Let's add one more student and see. So now this is empty, now it's working. So the create mutation and the get mutation is working perfect. So let's add a delete mutation for the each row. Let's close the application. Similarly, let's add one more query variable for delete, private string student return. Let's copy the mutation from here, delete student. So to delete, we have to pass the ID of type student, delete student input. So let's copy this method and name it as delete student. Student GraphQL request, delete student query, and delete student input. So we need only ID to delete the student. So ID equals student dot ID. So same endpoint. After delete, we are calling the get student again to refresh the page. So let's add a button and call this delete method from a click event. So let's add a new table. So let's copy this button, name it as remove, and delete student. Let's pass the variable to delete the student. So student dot ID. So let's have this ID here, int student ID. We'll pass this ID here. So the delete request is done. Let's check the behavior. Let's navigate to student data. So we have got the remove buttons here. Let's check removing the student Bakshi Gupta. Yeah, we are able to delete the student here. So let's check from the playground. So only 2 students are there. Yes. So let's add one more student. R 30. Guys, here we have come to an end of this video. This is a small example for the beginners where the GraphQL APIs are used in the Blazor client. If you like this video, please like and subscribe my channel. And if you want to know about Blazor or GraphQL in detail, let me know in the comment section. I'll make a separate video on GraphQL and Blazor. Thank you very much.